Okay, good day. Hello, anybody who is here. This is the office hours on April, what is it, the 16th, 2026, which is still crazy to me that it is 2026. And today we're going to be talking about things that I covered this week in class, no matter how weird and miserable and grim they may be. And then we're going to be talking a bit about why it matters that I explain safety acts and the sunsetting of Section 230 in the classes that I'm teaching. So I'm going to start in a few moments because I'll wait for some people to show up. But from now on, just so everybody knows and anybody who's watching this stream long after it's aired, every Thursday from here forward at 1 p.m. is going to be my office hours, which is this live stream, which I'm very happy to start doing as a very consistent act as part of my social media branding and my content strategy in order to give me a platform so that I end up being far more recognizable when I'm trying to sell books or sell papers or be invited to talks and so forth. So I actually do like this format a lot. This is now, I think, the third week of me doing live streaming, and it's slowly getting a little bit better and more comfortable in that sense. I think this is my angle. This corner is my angle for the live stream, which is different than the other angle, which is better for the TV hits, which is that corner with all of my, well, there's my diploma, but like with all the diplomas and all the artwork and everything on the side. So this is just easier because now I have my computer sitting in front of me and I have my other screen right here, which allows me to talk about the things I'm looking at. And thank you. Yes, the angles, not to lie to anybody on the stream, but I built this room specifically for this type of content. This is my office in my house, and I'm very happy to occupy it completely. And so I have all this space, and then I still have my Spawn action figure back here from a long time ago. So before I start and talk about the things I want to talk about today, which is KOSA, which is called the Kids Online Safety Act, which is in legislation now, and sponsored by the senator from my state, Connecticut, Senator Richard Blumenthal. And before I talk about that and the idea of sunsetting Section 230, which I think is a poor idea, I just want to tell a quick story, a media literacy anecdote that I thought which is kind of like somewhat helpful towards the framing of what we're going to be potentially covering today, or even like thinking about in terms of like how it's easier to understand and read media that is going on in any given sense. So obviously you all know that I've been studying far-right extremism and internet culture forever, but really far-right extremism since about 2016 and 2017. So it's been like basically a decade. Most specifically the manosphere, which has been my direct perspective on my framework on how I'm going to basically study far-right extremism. And so obviously recently, well, since the beginning of this year, since the Miami event, let's call it, when Clavicular decided to go mog hunting with his friends, Nick Fuentes, Andrew Tate, and all the other terrible misogynists. Since then, it's been pretty much the top of mind for a lot of people talking about the idea of looks maxing. And looks maxing is now mainstream or popular to talk about, although it is not a new subject matter. It is about 3 years old, and it's really about 15 or 16 years old. It comes from a subculture of incel culture, which is crazy to think that there's a subculture inside that subculture called lookism. And so the idea of looks maxing is now news. And the other part that makes it news is Clavicular, the main character of the looks maxing subculture, went to the hospital the other night on a suspected overdose on methamphetamines or whatever drugs he may be taking because he is using illicit drugs that probably aren't great for a 20-year-old body. Now, that on top of the fact that he has to take testosterone manually all the time because his body no longer produces it, because for the last 5 years he's been taking testosterone, which, you know, to be clear, just something to know, that's basically gender affirming care. Okay, that's what trans men would do too. So it's very interesting that this is like framed as on this. and Josh reported pentastack of 5 different drugs. And I don't even know what a pentastack may be, but that obviously means a stack of 5 things. And listen, taking that many drugs regardless is going to get your heart into a different place. I'm talking like drinking 2 Monster Energies in a row is going to get you in a messed up place. So taking methamphetamine with whatever other drugs he's taking is obviously not great for his body or his mind. Either way, it becomes top news now because I have this odd feeling, this feeling of how do you feel about somebody like Clavicular, Brendan Peters, because I'm always curious about whether or not I should feel compassionate for him. And I kind of feel compassionate because he is only 20 years old. And when I was 20 years old, I was very confused as well. And at that time, like that's between the ages of like 20 and like 23-ish, I was in a pretty dark space on the far right. And I was radicalized in a space where I kind of understand it. So there's a compassion of wondering, like, somebody should be looking out for this young man and making sure that he feels okay. But then there's part of me that's like, he is an adult, all right? He's 20 years old and hanging out with Myron Gaines and like Andrew Tate and all these misogynists is like, that's a choice, okay? So whether or not he wants to call himself apolitical or not, those are choices he's making about what community he's surrounding himself with. And looks maxing is a subculture of that. Anyway, what I'm getting at here is that yesterday I get a call from Inside Edition. Okay, so that's on CBS, Larry and Barry's CBS News. And Inside Edition, for those of you who don't know, is sort of a rag. Okay, it's basically gossip news, but framed as news. This isn't my first time being asked by Inside Edition to do a bite. I think the last time I was actually aired on Inside Edition was probably pre-pandemic. I think I was interviewed one other time, I think in 21 or 22 for something that had to do with memes, and I was cut. And I stopped telling people to go tune into Inside Edition. One, for their mental health. All right, that's for one. I don't really want to force people to go watch Inside Edition without, a reason to. Second, I'm also aware that somebody like me often gets cut from a show like Inside Edition because I'm an academic and I speak usually from a higher level than the public would understand on that. So I get asked yesterday, I got cold called from a producer, and they said, hey, can you comment on Clavicular, or can you comment on bone smashing, the technique or the tactic that goes into looks maxing? Bone smashing is it's a tactic in which you take a small or a hammer and you basically hit parts of your body where the bone is closest to the skin, the jaw, the cheek, the shoulders, the clavicles, and you fracture the bones, and it strengthens them or hardens them and allegedly reshapes it so they become more structural. Basically, you're manipulating the bones inside your body by mashing your face with them. Now, of course, the downside of that is that you're going to bruise too. The bones are beneath your skin, so there's a recovery process to this. So when they asked me, I was like, all right, I'll comment on this. But my mindset is this. It's a duality mindset. When I'm asked to talk about these things, I'm responsible for several parts when an expert is asked about something that falls under far right extremism. My responsibility, first and foremost, is for the viewer to make them understand that, like, you can't just say these words and not give context to them, because you can open the door to rabbit holes and people don't know how to use those rabbit holes. And so you really have to contextualize a lot of what happens with any extremist techniques, because you can't just say, oh, bone smashing, because then people will Google it. And most of the places in which bone smashing occurs, now it's in the news and you can see the news reports on it, but it could lead to like forums that explain how it's done or show people that are actually doing it without giving context for it. The other problem, of course, is that bone smashing is a tactic that is very sensational. News people want to cover it and they want to talk about it, but it's actually a really small amount of looks maxers actually do that tactic by comparison to the other tactics that are in it, which often fall into eating disorders or body dysmorphia problems. And a lot of that stuff is more accessible. In other words, like face bruising or shoulder bruising is much more visible, whereas like an eating disorder is something that happens silently and usually requires a lot of mental health help. Anyway, the point is, I get called I set up my whole studio. I set it up with the thing. I got my lights and everything. And of course, the guy gets on the air and he's like, "Oh, it looks like you've done this before." And I was like, I have. And then I do my bites. And of course, out of the listening to the interviewer ask me questions about it, I could hear the framework or the framing device that they're looking for. Now, I don't have a video clip of the clip itself. I tried to look for it, so I can't find um, yesterday's episode. I'm sure they haven't digitized yet, or it's just not important enough. But I could hear the framing, which is sensational. Like, you should be worried about your kids and hammers, basically. And so I was asked all about it. I said it, I openly admitted, I said, look, bone smashing is a smaller, hyper niche part of the overall movement of looks maxing. And I gave a lot of context to it. And I was just very careful with what I was saying because one, the reactionary groups would be upset about how I speak about that type of subject matter. And two, I don't want to give anybody the idea that this is accessible or you should do it. And then I hung up and waited and told a few people to go watch because, it's national news and it is fun to always get on national news. And as it aired, I was taping it because I was like, oh, this would be cool to show my kids my face appear on the screen. And instead of me appearing on the screen, a plastic surgeon appeared on the screen who is basically warning not to do it, which is good. He's warning, don't smash your face with a hammer because it ends up causing problems. And he says, and then of course there's a sensational moment where he's like, did you know? And he's talking to another woman next to him. It's like found footage. He goes, did you know? I found out a kid smashed his face so hard that a piece of his bone broke and went into his eye socket, which is probably what happened. That could happen in a basic injury too. But this is not the news coverage of looks maxing. This is a sensational news of a moral panic framework. The goal is for the audience to be afraid that their boys are getting a hold of hammers and mashing their faces to become looks maxers. So I got cut, basically put it down like that. But it is interesting to me that one, the interviewer, when he interviewed me, he said to me he had just found out about looks maxing 3 or 4 days ago. And this is a man who basically is the host of Inside Edition. And it is kind of his responsibility as a journalist to sort of know or understand or know about a subculture that's become fairly popular and prominent in the last couple of months. And so it was neat to me to hear that this was new information. Either way, I was happy to have given my bites, and I'm actually somewhat fortunate to have been cut because the moral panic framework of that doesn't align with my specific interest in how I would have told that story. So it's just something that's very interesting in terms of media literacy, which is if I'm guessing what happened was they interviewed me waiting on the plastic surgeon to answer his email of whether or not he'd be interviewed. And so I was the fallback interview. I was the one that was like the expert interview that they could always say, oh, well, we have an expert. But I think what they expected me to do as the expert was support their conclusions that looks maxing is metastasizing like cancer and bone smashing is the trend. And I just wouldn't do that because there's no research on that, number one. And number two, I don't think that's actually true. I think the moral panic part of this is what they were trying to get across, because the more moral panic that occurs, the more likely it is that people will be fearful of it, and that will to make more ratings coming into it. So if I really want the airtime from here forward, I just have to go onto people's TV shows and start screaming and just be like, we're all going to die. We're all going to die. And just be really freaked out about everything. And I think that would have got me on air. I think so. So there's a media literacy intro for this. So welcome again for everybody who's here. My name is Jamie Cohen, and I am a digital culture expert, and my main focus on research is internet culture and critical internet literacies and brand safety and safety. For those of you who are just joining or you coming in, feel free to ask any questions or post anything you would want me to talk about. I know towards the end, I'll answer some questions from last week that had come across that I want to address, just so I make sure that I'm not leaving some people out. So I'll make sure that is on there too. And then if you want to drop how you found the stream or where you're from, that's cool too, because this is a live stream. So we could create a community approach to this where you could talk to each other in the stream or agree on it. I do have safety mode on, which just means that you can't brigade the chat. You just have to wait 5 seconds. But otherwise, it's your basic live stream. So what I want to talk about today is something that I spoke about early this week. Yeah, I mean, and big thanks to Malloy for bringing me to meet Josh Chaplain many years ago too. I just as a note of gratitude and thanks, I'm glad that we know each other, and I'm glad for your support. I'm glad for you to be here. I don't think I could do most of this without you, just to be a little sappy about that. But yeah, big thanks to the schools that I've worked at and the institutions I've worked at to make sure that we're all connected. And Josh and I are connected today at Queens College, which I do love my institution that I work at today. And I have tenure, which means I'm there forever. Now, one of the big parts about this live stream is that it is a follow-up. And I do want to make this a consistent follow-up to basically what I am researching in real time. New Media Homework, which is my Substack, was originally designed that way. It was designed to be the more textual version of what I cover in class. And if you were to follow like its trend, it really originally started as like a schoolwork thing during the pandemic. So I launched it so people could tune in and see what my research was, because I was teaching majority online at that point, and I was actually back in the private sector. And now I'm back to the public sector at CUNY, and it's what I teach is still, unfortunately, as academia is meant to do, is it's gate kept. It's it's in the ivory tower. And so I want to use this opportunity on YouTube to basically talk about what I talk about with my students. And I think it's really important. This week in particular, we talked about KOSA, Section 230, and surveillance. That's what we talked about in my brand safety course. So I teach 2 courses in the undergrad and 1 course in the graduates this semester. And my undergraduate course, Brand Safety, is really a course about trust and safety. It is really about, like, how do we talk about trust and safety? What does trust and safety do inside of a domain, inside of a space, on the internet, from the platform level, from the perspective of user safety, but most importantly, reframing it around the terms of how do brands or advertisers feel safe online? And what I consider safe online is user experience, is making sure that when you stay online, you don't want to leave because you've been made uncomfortable or there's something pushing you off of that platform. So trust and safety is really one of those things where you really want to be part of how the platform operates from a perspective of health. Oh, Martina's here. Thank you. No, so nice to see you too. Yeah, please check this out also. This will be saved on the stream. And I think Martina, you was nice enough to go to the Digital Void talk in the UK when we talked in Brighton. So thank you for being there for that. That was one of the most fun Digital Void talks that I remember doing. But thank you. Yeah, so thank you for being there. And please, yeah, of course, tune in later. Anyway, so this week, the reason we're talking about it is because in my brand safety course, we've basically made it to a point where we're considering the darker, I don't want to say the darker, but really what content moderation actually is. And one of the assignments that I have the students respond to is this article that I found from 2016, actually. And, oh, it won't let me in there because of my VPN. Secret Rules of the Internet is what it's called. The Secret Rules of the Internet was written in 2016 about a team of trust and safety experts known as, I do have a Verge subscription. I just don't know why I'm not signed in, and my archive is launching. But it was discussing like how do you maintain safety online? Now, the story here is actually very interesting because it is about how does the internet actually operate within its rules? And what I mean by its rules is that content moderation is an editorial form of censorship, so to speak. Okay, that means that platforms themselves engage in editorial decisions to remove content that they deem harmful to the audience, to the platform, to the user experience, which means people who operate inside of the content moderation and trust and safety fields are technically bad for business. And they're bad for business because they reduce the content online to change the user experience. But when it comes to entire divisions like this, what we forget from a user perspective is that when we use the internet, we use a filtered internet. The internet is not only filtered by its algorithms or sorted in proper ways, but human beings, teams of them, hundreds of thousands of human beings just like you, sit at the front lines of the internet. They are the first responders of the web, and they watch as things either come in and get flagged, which means like content has made it to the platform and been pushed back down by users who felt uncomfortable, or that have been technically flagged by a machine and pushed into the content moderation space to be cleared for publication or removed from the internet entirely. And the question posed by the Verge article, written by two amazing authors, it's written by Catherine Bruni and Soraya Chemali, who basically talk about the idea that the content moderators are technically deciding the rules of the internet, who gets to shape the platform itself. Students get an opportunity to basically take a look at this and think about what it means to shape culture through its censorship. And the article does this beautiful, very global perspective on how the internet operates. And for example, one of the notes that are in it this is 2016, notes that in Saudi Arabia at the time, women driving was not allowed to be seen on screen. So people had to content moderate that off. Whereas in the US, that is not a problem. So each region has its own version of censorship and expression that are just dictated by a team of people meant to keep you safe. This is important to understand because in 2016, I would mark 2016 as like the point. Okay, that's the moment, if you know what I mean. Okay. Well, we could see like Viktor Orban was elected in 2010 and populism in Europe had started to grow. The United States populism by 2015 was starting to boil up. And in 2016, the election of Donald Trump basically shifted us into a place where harms and trust and safety became at the forefront of how we have a user experience on the internet. We're now a decade later. This is now 1 decade, 10 years after we had this discussion about the forefront of retrospect of how trust and safety operates. And now we're at a point where platforms like X barely have a trust and safety. They barely have anything because they provide free expression for their users. And I'm using a lot of scare quotes today because a lot of these terms are basically nuanced. It doesn't mean that you could just understand them from the forefront, which means that to talk about this in a classroom setting takes us some time. It takes us literally 3 hours to really discuss like what it is to get from this, what nuance it is to get from it. So this week, the most important thing that came from this week was to reanalyze the outcome of the social media addiction trial, the one that found Meta and Google guilty of basically causing social media addiction. And then, of course, it was referred to in Taylor Lorenz's piece with Kat Tenbarge called The Truth About Social Media Addiction Trial. That piece was pretty much our framework for our discussion. This is the piece here. I will obviously afterward put a link down in the bio to explain so you could go and watch this because this hour is worth it. It's not only worth it, but it is worth watching the entirety of the video because it is the deeper explanation that I won't be able to get to in this specific hour, but it's also something that I've made my homework for my students this week because I want them to watch it and correct it. And we were really talking about is right here. You can actually see what Taylor's done here. We were talking about what's known as the algorithmic imaginary. Okay, that's the term we used. The algorithmic imaginary, I think, is a term that is used out there, but I took it directly from Adam Alexic's work. Adam Alexic is better known as etymology nerd on Instagram and TikTok, and he wrote the book Algospeak. And Algospeak is a book about how we change our language or self-censor our language for platform safety. So we basically replace words to make sure it's there. And you can see that Taylor Lorenz does it on her work. If you listen to her work on her podcast or you watch her videos, you'll hear her bleep certain words because she's aware of the algorithm self-censoring it. But she's also very risk averse due to the fact that she speaks about this type of material and she's monetized. She has to be very aware that she could become demonetized by the way the platforms basically push down her content due to the fact that it's doing safety work, automated safety work. And what that brought us to was this entire discussion about why acts like the Kids Online Safety Act or the sunsetting of Section 230 are not good ideas. And I know that sounds crazy and it sounds crazy to explain it to somebody, because the first response when anybody says, well, we shouldn't have the Kids Online Safety Act, their first gut reaction is, what, you don't want to keep kids safe? It's literally built into its language to make the person defending the anti-position feel like they're the enemy. And that's pretty interesting when it comes to legislation. But it's more interesting when you find out what the reason is that they want to ban kids from using the internet. So again, let me just recap here. We're about halfway through. I just want to, if anybody's watching this from home or if anybody's here, like, please decide, like, if you want, I mean, add any comments or feel free to have a conversation about this, but I'm going to give you the same prompt I gave my students at the end too, which is, how do we explain this to the normies? How do we explain this to people who are fairly unattached to political dealings in their everyday life? People who watch media, understand media, but don't really ingest it the way I do, with a broken brain as a very online internet personality. So first, let's talk about KOSA. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly show you a little bit about what that means. So as I said, it's my doing this. This is Richard Blumenthal, U.S. Senator for Connecticut, and he's kind of the main sponsor of KOSA. Okay, so what is the Kids Online Safety Act? And of course, there's a lot of blathering at first. It's no secret that children and teenagers are more glued to their screens than ever before. Children 8 to 12 spend an average of 5 hours per day on their screens, while teenagers lock over 8 hours a day. Now, that's actually lower than what it really is. It's technically far higher than that, because multi-screens count against that. So while it says 8 hours a day, that technically adds up, because it's a cell phone plus a laptop that doubles it. So it could be 16. On some studies, shows that young people spend over 24 hours a day on screens. That's the screen time. In today's age of social media, the statistics on mental health, here comes, the mental health issues amongst the young are staggering. Almost half of U.S. teens have experienced bullying, harassment online. Now, what's left out of that is the questions of, yes, this act is looking at the way online is operating, but it's leaving out the part that doesn't take into consideration that more than half of teens are bullied offline as well. So it's not just an online issue. It's a very specific issue to teenagerdom, which has to be fixed systemically, not just from an act. But the problem with the act in particular is that it not only wants to ban, it's not a true full ban, let's say, so to speak. What it is a way of monitoring the way that teenagers use the internet. Basically, it's a ban before the age of 13, and then up to the age of 16, it turns the privacy settings into a different thing. Privacy settings are mandatory for younger children. And then basically it creates a guarded system. And that term, the guarded thing, let me just bring up the actual language for this so I can say it correctly, is that it uses this. It mandates something called a duty of care to prevent harms like exploitation, bullying, and mental health issues. Now, duty of care is interesting. Duty of care allows parents of teenagers to basically have access to their social media. It means that the person who's in care of the teenager gets to oversee the teenager's use online. It's also legislated in terms of like what can and cannot be seen, what type of censorious acts basically do it. And it also dictates what can be seen by young people. In other words, their access points. Now, all of this is like, this all makes sense. This is great. Parents should have access to seeing what their children do. Parents should know what they have and how to manage their privacy and what they are talking to and make sure of it, because children are extremely vulnerable. They're the most vulnerable class that exists. There's no place for children in the society, and very often children are left to be at the whims of the adults around them. I mean, as somebody who has babies, like obviously they're vulnerable. You have to take care of them. You never know who they're interacting with. So from a perspective of language, it sounds perfectly reasonable to put a duty of care in charge of it. But what it does leave out is the truth about the way that people use social media and teenagers use social media, and the way that people who are in more vulnerable positions. And when I say vulnerable, I mean young people who are facing identity issues, young people who are trying to figure out their place in the world, queer communities, people of color, have communities of care, mutual aid, any type of care that exists outside of the mainstream use will basically be diminished or removed from the internet because of an act like this. And so my comeback statement to this is always like, do we just not care about people's growth? Do we not care about it? Because here's the thing that's interesting about social media. You can't turn it off. You can't undo the internet. We are now in a internet mediated society. We are a social media world. To undo that, to unlatch that would create an immense amounts of harm for tons of people. But what's interesting is this constant, back to the story about the looks maxing thing that I began the stream with. What's left out is the idea of the moral panic, that a lot of these acts, the Kids Online Safety Act or sunsetting Section 230, all of these things are attached to moral panics about young people and their mental health or their safety and making sure that their harms are lower. So then we should also take a look at like what are teenagers actually saying about this? I think it's important for us to know it. Well, we're in luck, okay? Because yesterday, today's the 16th, yesterday, April 15th, Pew released a new study. So Pew, obviously, it's a very specific research center. Okay, it has a very specific way of basically doing its research and interviewing people and making sure that their information the information gathering is very specific. I use Pew quite often in my research because they represent my angle of research, which is much more internet culture based. And this study comes out yesterday, April 15th, 2026. Teens' experiences on YouTube, on TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat. And I think that's most important to talk about in this case. When I surveyed my students empirically in class, writing on the board, where are their platforms? Where did they get their information from? What is their most used platforms? It was TikTok and Instagram. Not so much Snapchat, though they did admit that Snapchat was very used by them in their high school years. So now that they're college students, it's wavering off the use, okay? So this is an interesting study because it actually says something very fascinating about how people believe the TikTok is used and how it's really used. Okay, so here's one. Teen TikTok users go on there for entertainment, Snapchat for friends and family. So the question was, what do you go online for? Because it's entertaining was the major reason. 82%, the net percent of 96% of respondents said it was mostly for entertainment. Same with Instagram and Snapchat. And then, of course, to know what's going on with friends and family, TikTok ranked lowest because it is a platform for content, whereas Instagram and Snapchat. Now, this is really, really important to understand. To read between the lines here of this is to understand that most social media use is not about content digestion. Most internet use is what's known as pro-social use. Pro-social use is communication, using social media as a social tool, as connecting with others and communicating with them. So when the question is asked by Pew to know what's going on with family and friends, it's not about seeing what they're posting. The question is vague. It's how we keep in contact with one another. So you can see that TikTok ranks lower on that because it's not really a communication app, as much as Instagram and Snapchat are communication apps. They're used for their pro-social use much more, or in terms of it's not much more, but in terms of the use, it's equaled out with that. And here it is here. Direct messaging and posting. Teen Snapchat users message and post more often than those on Instagram and TikTok because it's a messaging tool. I mean, that's self-explanatory, but I guess studies like this come out where you got to inform everybody. So the net 57%, 41% several times a day communicate on it, Instagram, and then TikTok lowest. And then post or share, you can actually see posting and sharing is pretty low in all cases, less than 28% on all platforms, which tells you that the majority of use is communication. And of course, that brings me to the point which debunks or at least pushes back against what is the healthy parts of this. Now, does it hurt sleep? Yes, that's what they say. So the majority of people says it neither helped nor hurt their sleep patterns. But those on TikTok say TikTok does hurt their sleep. And that is because TikTok leads to doom scrolling or doom holes, like scroll bed rotting, And what that means is I always refer to it in terms of time travel. I always like the idea that when you look at when you look at TikTok, like time just disappears. And I would love to know if anybody has this problem too. If you want to add your opinions on this, do you ever find yourself time traveling when you're using these apps? Do you ever feel like when you start the app, you look down and then you look up, an hour has just disappeared, just straight up gone? So you could travel to the future via your social media apps, and it does do that, which means it does upset your sleep. And that makes sense, because when you start scrolling on it, you forget that you're like should be sleeping. Productivity, you can see obviously these aren't productive tools, but now here becomes the part that matters most to me: mental health. Okay. This is so interesting to me. When it looks at mental health, 71% say it neither helped nor hurt when it came to TikTok. But you can see on all of them, mental health increased, was beneficial due to the platform rather than negative due to the platform. So of the respondents who said help, hurt, or help, more people were helped by the platform TikTok, Snapchat, and Instagram than were hurt by it. Friendships increased immensely. TikTok, lowest, again, because it's the less social of all the platforms. Snapchat, of course, is a friend app. It's literally like a friends connector. And Instagram is mainly for you could DM and talk on those and see people's stories. So it responds that way. But this helps, these two part of these categories right here basically explains that these platforms don't, from the teen's perspective, let's keep that in mind too. Let's reframe this. This isn't from a parent's perspective, from a teen's perspective, see this as a benefit to them. And you can see down here, impact on self-esteem. This is the chart makes it look very different than what it actually is. Majority of teens on Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok say the sites do not impact their self-esteem. The majority of them say it makes their self-esteem better. Very small amount worse. Equal amount is in here, and then no difference is the majority on all three. So you can see that help is a higher percentage than hurt. And then in all cases, it makes no difference to it. In other words, the platforms themselves exist outside of their experiences. And this is one of those things where I often try to remind people that when we have discussions about harms and safety and where these things, where the borderlands are between what makes people feel like they're welcome online or not, sometimes they forget that these types of platforms experience from a teenager's perspective is far different than perspective as adults, parents, administrators, teachers, legislators, or unfortunately, the lobbyists. And those who are lobbying by far the most are people who will benefit from bans like this. And here's where it gets a little complicated and why we need to be really, really concerned about apps like this. So I talked to my students about this, and I was actually somewhat a little shocked by how much they didn't know about mass surveillance. And this is where it's important for us to start talking about what happens if an online ban appears and how online bans are actually activated. What do you do with a ban? How do you actually ban a child from the internet? Because children don't have IDs. So when they use the term age verification, now I'm quoting almost directly from Taylor Lorenz here, okay? Because sometimes it makes me feel insane. And I'm sure she's insane as well. It feels insane that like there's so few people reporting directly on this subject matter. I really am unsure why this isn't a constant, at least a discussion or a debate where at least there's a representative that comes from people trying to defend the anti-surveillance parts of this. And it seems like there's just far fewer. In order to remove a child from the internet or maintain a guard on them to make sure they're safe online, you have to make sure you know how old a child is. How do you know they're 13? They don't have an ID. There's no way to know that. Very few young people have access. Very few people have access to mobility in this country or globally. So passports would be a way of having an identification. But I mean, I'm very fortunate. My children I work overseas in the summer. I work in Rome and I work in Salzburg, Austria. So my children, they're babies, we got them passports. So they do have IDs, but that is a very rare thing for young people to have identification. So how do you, Josh makes a joke here that's very funny, which is stares at billionaire-owned media and Citizens United fundraising incentives, which is exactly kind of what it sounds like, which is that the incentive of the billionaire class is kind of pushing this, but silently from the background. Because now you have to think about, how do you know a child is a child? You have to gain access to data. Every one of us, everyone watching the stream, everybody in my class, all people who pretty much exist, in a basic daily event of just using the internet, just being somebody who's online, have about 70,000 points of data at any given moment. That includes their location data, which is hundreds of points there, all their IP address data, all their email data, all their chat data. It's just a ton of data that comes off of us. It's a small amount of data of what exists. Okay, they don't have a lot of facial recognition data. They don't have a lot of biometric data. Apple in particular collects data but keeps it on its devices. But they lack that type of bigger data sets. Now, the thing about data sets too is important. You can't access the data. 70,000 is a big number. How do you look at 70,000 and contextualize 70,000? Well, in the age of AI, these big LLMs and these big systems, one of the main uses of LLMs right now, or AI tools, is search technique, search functionality. And when you're using ChatGPT or any of those things, you're using it more likely like a communication of a search technology. So you could ask it a question in human language rather than Boolean language, which is like the original search language. And it'll parse your text to go and do that search and gather the information and contextualize and bring it back. And so now the problem is that data is now more accessible by technology companies. So back to surveillance. So if you are a baby, how do you know you're a baby? Well, the first thing is face mapping. You turn on a camera and maps it, and it's like, oh, that's a baby. But some people have baby faces. Some people have adult faces. And I'm not saying like a 4-year-old here. I'm talking about like borderline, like 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds. The other way that you could definitely make sure that a child is a child is by surveilling their parents. That's how you would do it. And this is why I call Richard Blumenthal's office at least once a week and try to tell him to stop sponsoring this. But I'm one person, and I'm sure out of the many calls, there's a lot more people who are out there being like, you got to keep the kids safe. You got to keep them safe. Not thinking about how much this has a harm attached to it. In order to know a child is a child, you surveil the parents, because I have 2 kids. Okay. So how do I know where my kids' their ages are? So beyond the face scan, the thing that you could ask about the children is like, okay, now if you're surveilling me, you could keep track of their age. For example, if I buy a 4T t-shirt, a child's t-shirt, obviously I'm not buying it for myself, which means you can estimate that my child is about, actually, I don't know how big a 4T is. My kids are kind of big. So you can imagine they're young, okay? So they're young babies because they're wearing these t-shirts that obviously won't fit me. But that tells the surveillance systems about how young they are. On top of that, then you could collect a lot more of the stronger data, birth certificates, data about their health, data about what age groups they're in, what they're doing in school, play school or preschool or daycare type of data. Bigger data sets, huge. Do you think Meta is going to host this much data? It's huge. They're already investing in AI. No. What they do is they hire a third-party team to basically manage the data. And how can you be sure that that data won't get out? How could you be sure that they will not sell that data? How could you be sure that someday under an administration that's far more authoritarian, it doesn't get used directly against people because it's data? It's not the content online. It's not the fear of the things. It's the fact that you're being watched and your children are being watched through these systems to keep you safe. In other words, it is a rug pull on the idea of safety. It is designed specifically to enhance the surveillance models, to create larger data sets of data on every person, and to remove them from the internet. Kat Tenbarge later in the episode says something that's very, very dark that I didn't really think about until she said it, which is important for us to conceptualize and think about too, which is one of the biggest goals of any platform or any system is to remove you long enough from the internet so that you do not develop your identity in the global sense as a global citizen, but rather enter the world kind of like a blank slate at around age 16, 17, or 18. You're far more manipulatable at age 17 if you have no history of being of having the internet as a stance or a way of developing your identity, which a lot of young people have used. And then, of course, that allows you to be shifted in the way that they want you to. And the thing here that's so crazy, and back to Josh's note about Citizens United, is this isn't even just about Citizens United. This is about Project 2025. These goals are very much aligned with the Heritage Foundation's ideas of controlling young people's identities or models of political involvement so that they shift a certain way. And then, of course, that gives me my little ability to remind people that Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Anxious Generation, that has become the doorstop for me, but really the idea of people reading this and being all worked up and moral panicked about young people having massive mental issues online. He cherry picks his data, of course, to make it make sense for him. He collaborates with the Heritage Foundation. So it's like, how could we separate ourselves from the angle or the bent that comes from the moral panic inducers, from the legislation that's being pushed to reduce harm, but actually increase surveillance? And my students, not to say my students are very bright. I mean, they're college students and they're taking an elective about brand safety. That's a choice they're making. But they didn't know about the Patriot Act. They didn't know about FISA, which is about to be renewed. They didn't know about the NSA basically, siphoning up every single part of things. And you know what the weirdest part? They don't know who Edward Snowden is. So young people today are coming into a world that's already been blanked of its past histories of surveillance technologies that basically are operating at scale all the time. So they don't even know that the constant surveillance that operates underneath them, no less the modern surveillance tools that will be put in that will be AI searchable. On top of that, remember the NSA's data is the NSA's, it's the government's data. When we're talking about the data here, when we're talking about the data that's being used to be siphoned up from keeping children offline, you're talking about third-party or private data that the platforms themselves will be dictating. And again, once you have private data, you have commodifiable data. That means you can sell it. That means you can use it in ways that are much more nefarious or dark than you might even imagine. And so when we talk about the Kids Online Safety Act, we have to find ways of discussing this without it just took me almost a half hour to do, without doing the entire nuanced perspective of all of this. I don't really shock and awe my students with this, but it's important to know that these are there. These are the parts of the systems. The best way I found it was when I started talking about the sunsetting of Section 230. Section 230 is a fairly complicated act. I'll in the links, I'll share an article from Mike Masnick that describes how Section 230 actually operates and the things that we misunderstand about it. But in short, in the very shortest way I could describe it, it basically allows platforms to not take responsibility for the content on the platform to maintain their platformness. Okay, so that's not truly what it totally does, but it allows platforms to lower their responsibility for the material on site. Very nuanced, of course, because platforms still do editorial decisions with trust and safety, content moderation. That's an editorial decision. So they are doing platform-based publication decisions. So it's not completely free, but it allows them to avoid the lawsuits, the massive lawsuits that come from people who basically claim harm or addiction to the internet and say, oh, it's the platform's fault. And they say, no, it's the person who uploaded the content. That's the responsibility. So you can't sue us, you have to sue them. But we forget that lawsuits aren't just I'm going to sue you, and then you go move to a lawyer and do it. Lawsuits are extremely, extremely expensive. And so when you sue a platform, they have to endure the lawsuit. And to endure the lawsuit means that they might be facing millions and millions of dollars of damage. For example, the social media addiction lawsuit resulted in a $375 million loss to Meta and Google. Based on their value, the $375 million, just so you know, while it sounds insane to you, I can't think of what $375 million would even equate to, is the equivalent of $17 if you made $65,000 a year. That's how much they're losing. Okay? So, in other words, they can endure $375 million loss because it's $17 to them, whereas the average platformer Blue Sky or smaller or any like smaller platform, if they're faced with a similar lawsuit, they cannot endure it. They'd have to shut their doors. And the reason this comes up is like Joseph Gordon-Levitt a few weeks ago stood in front of Congress and told a story through tears about how his children are so hurt. And I thought about it. I'm like, you know what? That's so crazy because Joseph Gordon-Levitt runs a platform called Hit Record Joe or Hit Record. And Hit Record is a prompt-based platform. It's a user-generated platform. People upload content to his platform. It gets remixed by the people who work for his platform and basically gets repurposed media onto there, which means it's a UGC site, which means he benefits from Section 230. And so it really is sort of embarrassing to know that he's stumping for the sunsetting of it without the most important part. Both KOSA and 230, KOSA or ideas like KOSA could be admirable, could be. And the sunsetting of Section 230 could be a good idea. But before either of those acts need to be adapted, we need, first and foremost, massive privacy laws, ways in which we protect our data, protect children from their data being usurped today or in the future, to protect us from our data being manipulated, removed, taken, sold, whatever you want. Our data, things that are captured from us right now, flow directly through the government. We are flagged, we are censored, we are considered algorithmic imaginaries. And what that means is like being aware that when we speak online, an algorithm may be seeing us, but we don't know because it's a black box. So we can't imagine. We have to imagine what's in that black box. We don't actually know what's in there. Those algorithmic imaginaries have to be maintained through privacy. We need privacy laws. We need data protection laws. We need ways in which we as citizens aren't taken advantage of by third-party companies or even our US government when they misuse our data for their benefit, for their idea of what safety is. All of these acts are coming before the safety part. So while they all sound like safety, they are the opposite of safety. And that's something that when I talked about this with my students, it's really important because in the United States, Silicon Valley is where it comes from. So most of our platforms are US or Western-centric platforms. They are designed specifically for a culturally commodified space, very much a commercial environment. And so when that's the case, as people who do trust and safety or brand safety are aware of the borderlands of harm, the first thing people often look at is where do the advertisers feel the most safe? That's how we usually dictate what trust and safety is. Trust and safety is looked at like where advertisers are the safest, not us. And so inside of that, we have to really be pretty, we have to be much more careful. We have to be much more careful about this. And I'm glad I have a class of students who are very much into learning about trust and safety and brand safety and how brands' identity, the class is shaped around brand identity, how brands maintain their identity on the internet. But we should also make sure we consider the metaphor there, which is how do we, in the non-neoliberal sense of the brand, but in the idea of ourselves as an independent person, how do we maintain our identity online, knowing that these environments can be pro-social? And I think it's important to do this. Like, so here's last bit I'll talk about right here. This is kind of what I'll be putting down in there, is we need to embrace the shift to pro-social media. Engagement and profits on social media are built from fomenting dissatisfaction, but there's a better alternative. In other words, there's better ways to use social media. We do not have to be using it as absorbing negative content. We could be using it to make pro-social environments. And this one, they note the fact-checking, the idea of community notes is a community approach to making sure the internet is healthier. We are using chats and we are discussing things with each other. We're also gaining ideas about how our identity gets developed. Tumblr, between the years of 2010 and 2014, I created a form of feminism that young people today benefit from, both men and women. Whether or not the manosphere exists as a reactionary movement to that, those types of spaces were really important to the development of the identity of my current college students. And I can't imagine a space where the internet isn't really a benefit to people's everyday lives when we know it is beneficial. especially to young people who may be struggling with the way that they interact with the world around them. The internet is one of the most important tools that's ever been made in human history. And while it's very, very, very easy to blame it for woes and problems, it is also the place of generally positive environmental health. And it's really hard to explain that to somebody who goes on Inside Edition and sees young men bashing their face with hammers and be like, there's an epidemic, when it's like 20 dudes. 20. It's a minority of a minority of a minority of a minority of young men bone smashing. And like, they're the people that create content to do that, because it's really an MLM of content creation. So how do you separate when you see something on TV that looks like it's the world, when it's a teeny little thing, from the information that is nuanced and layered that we have to get to people to make sure that we aren't subject to the harms like ultra surveillance or sales surveillance or everyday biometric data being absorbed, or your children being watched through your purchasing data. I don't want to go to Carter's and buy my kids a Grinch shirt and have a safety company look at it and be like, oh, they're 5 now. They still can't use the internet. I don't want them knowing they're 5. I don't want them knowing my purchase history. I don't want them knowing any of that. And that comes from an act like the Kids Online Safety Act. So when you get a chance, call your senators, call your congresspeople, and tell them to reconsider passing these types of protection legislations without considering the outcomes of what happens when they're implemented. It's your right. You should contact your representatives. That's why they're called representatives. They literally represent you. It's a very easy call. I've never talked to them directly. You talk to their aides, you talk to their voicemails. It doesn't matter. You don't have to even use a script. Just the fact you call matters, because they literally don't know what your opinion is unless you call them. They literally don't know. It's like me not knowing who's on the other side of the screen. Like I assume that this is what you're interested in because you're interested in my form of research, but in terms of like what you do or what you're interested in, I only know by how you talk to me. And so the senators and the congresspeople, the people that represent you, you really need to talk to them. You need to tell them your opinions, and it would be a benefit to all of us. And with that all said, that was what I talked about this week, aside from all the other interesting stuff about sponsored content and tactical media and all that other stuff, which I'll get to in future talks. Next week, I'll be speaking about social media trends that have appeared behind all of this. We haven't really talked, because looksmaxing and Manosphere has so dominated this semester, really, since this year. There's a lot of cool internet trends that have been going on behind it that haven't seen a lot of attention. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what internet trends come up, and I want to focus on some of the more global parts of that and global perspectives. Last week, Sophia talked to me about the idea of what it is in Latin America, to talk about the way that ecosystems work in the global South and in Latin America, and how they're different in meme cultures that come from those spaces that I often leave out, because again, there's just way too much to talk about. There's so much to cover when we're talking about internet culture. And it's one of the things that I will talk about next week, is to talk about when memes are created in different places, they are representative or reflective on the environment in which they occur too. And so Sophia was talking specifically from the Latin Americans' perspective, and from the perspective of places like in the North. And Sophia brought up an interesting point that I was like, didn't think about, which is the environment itself. Like literally the way that temperature or environment or climate affects how we create media. Like that is something I don't think about all too often. And so that's something I think we could benefit from having a discussion about. But until then, thank you for being here. Thank you for those who popped in during the stream, didn't come in during the stream, watched the stream, commented, and those of you who stuck around most of the time. I really do appreciate all of it. And I will be back next week. From here forward, it's every Thursday at 1 p.m. It's office hours, and it will be at a site, newanddigital.com. I'm making a hyperlink for it, so it'll be a website, and it'll be there forever. You can also follow me at newmediahomework.substack.com, which is my newsletter, Network Issues, which is the YouTube channel, which is the YouTube series I do with Destiny Day. And you can follow me on Instagram at Jamie Cohen, and LinkedIn, James N. Cohen. So please follow me and keep track of this. But if you have anything you want to talk about, I'd be glad to have a conversation with you about it. Thanks again for being here.